everyone, and welcome back to Mariana Mas Books. My name is Mariana, and today I am here with a fun little sort of tag. Has it ever happened to you that you maybe start a membership for a gym, you register for a gym, or you buy super fancy workout clothes, or you buy workout equipment because in your mind you are going to exercise and you are going to be this athletic person? That's kind of like your idealized self, but in reality you don't exercise and your gym membership goes unused, or your gym equipment that you bought ends up being a place where you just pile your books on top of it, or your laundry, maybe that type of thing, where it's your idealized self. You think you're going to do one thing, or you wish you did one thing, but in reality that's not really who you are or how you are, that type of thing. So today what I want to talk about is my idealized reader self. So the things that I wish that I read, or that in my mind I think, oh, I would like to read this book, but it's more because of my idealized reader self than my actual reader self. That's what I want to share today. And before I do, I just want to give credit to Gigi at the Craft Earth Power channel, because this is another tag that I am bringing from tarot tubing to booktube, but it's not about tarot, and I'm not going to speak about tarot. I'm not going to show tarot cards or anything. It's just that the idea came from there. Over there, Gigi called it my fantasy tarot self, but I didn't want to call it my fantasy reader self because fantasy is a big genre of literature and it's a big genre in booktube. I thought it would be confusing if I called this my fantasy reader self, because people would assume that it was a video related to fantasy, and it's not. So instead I'm calling it my idealized reader self. And it's not really a tag per se, but I would love it either if you would do it or if you would tell me in the comments, because I think it's a super fun idea of thinking, my ideal version of myself, what does she look like? What does she look like as a reader? What does her library look like? What does she read? And so I'm just going to show you random things that my idealized reader self does. The first thing that my idealized reader self likes to read is weird fiction. I just think that people who read weird fiction are the coolest people out there. Just in general, if you read weird fiction, you are so cool to me. Just weird books, weird novellas, absurdist fiction, and I always wish that I was cool enough to read weird fiction, but the truth is that whenever I read weird fiction, I just don't get it. I'm just like, no, that's not for me. I'm not cool enough for this book. As an example, last year there was in September, shortly September, the readathon, and I read a novella that is kind of like an absurdist novella by a writer from the city where I'm from, and it's called Xanto, and I'm going to put the cover up there. But I read that one, and it's super weird, and it's absurdist, and it's weird fiction, and I read it because I wanted to feel cool, because I think it's a very cool thing to do. For Invisible Cities, I also attempted to read several weirder translated fiction, and I mean that's just like a plus, right? If you read weird translated fiction, then you are even cooler in my book. And so I attempted to read Can Shui, I think is her name, vertical something. I forget the name because I DNF'd it. It's a book of short stories, and I keep trying because I think it's so cool, and it's like such an intellectual thing to do. to read weird fiction. But if I am honest with myself, it's not for me. I don't read it. It's my idealized reader self. So that's one thing. Then another thing comes from just an interaction I had recently, because I have been talking about Ancient Sathon and how I want to read Beowulf, and David Wiley suggested that I could actually read several translations of Beowulf, because Beowulf is such a short work. And actually I am interested in doing this, but I think this is something that is also coming from my idealized reader self. So this is something that I've seen Jennifer Brooks do as well, and other people that I consider super cool and super smart, where they will read several translations of the same work to compare translations. I have never done it myself, and I'm going to see maybe if I feel like it for Beowulf, but I'm not sure that I'm gonna, because I think that is my idealized reader self. My idealized reader self is interested in comparing translations, several translations of the same work. Again, for the same reason of the weird fiction, because I think it's super cool and super intellectual, and I want to look super cool and super intellectual. But I think that's part of my idealized reader self, and in reality I think that I'm not going to have the drive to go through with it, because I think I would have to have a really close relationship with a piece of work in order to read several translations. So for instance, let's say The Lord of the Rings was written in another language that wasn't English, and then it was translated into English or into Spanish. Maybe I would read several translations just because I'm already interested in The Lord of the Rings. But just in general, like taking a classic and comparing translations, I think that falls more into my idealized reader self. And speaking of translations, I think my idealized reader self would love to have a favorite translator and no translators. And sometimes I see people who are like, oh, this translator just translated a new piece of work and I'm going to read everything they translate. And I would love that as well, because again, super cool, super intellectual. I think you can sense a pattern of my idealized reader self is very cool and very intellectual. It's my idealized reader self is a bit of a hipster. I'm just going to say it like that. And then finally, I just wanted to throw in there, I think my idealized reader self is a super hardcore fantasy reader. You know how much I love fantasy, and I love reading fantasy, but if I'm being honest with you guys, I mostly read like fantasy romance stuff, and I do want to read more fantasy. I stopped reading fantasy for a lot of years just because I didn't know what a lot of adult fantasy that is out there, just because it's not a genre that you find in bookstores, at least not here in Mexico. If you go into a bookstore and you see the tables with the new releases, it's always literary fiction. It's always like Nobel Prize winners, Latin American literary fiction, or Spanish literary fiction. That type of thing is the thing that you see in bookstores. And so I stopped reading fantasy for a lot of years until I discovered BookTube, and that's when I started learning about all of these different fantasy authors. And so I'm not really very well read in terms of fantasy, and I would like to, and I am starting to read more fantasy and be a bit, like search out more adult fantasy. But at the moment, there is more of an idealized reader self. There is a hardcore fantasy reader and reads fantasy classics and that type of thing. I would love to be that type of person, or my idealized reader self is the type of person that is very knowledgeable about fantasy and fantasy classics. That's something I aspire to. I think those are the things that I wanted to talk about, or those are the things that come to mind. Oh yeah, one more thing. My idealized reader self writes super smart marginalia. I annotate books. I love writing in books, but if I am honest with you, my marginalia is mostly little hearts or little smiley faces, the occasional LOL, or an exclamation point when it's something that blows my mind or it's something really interesting or something. I will write an exclamation point next to it, but that's mostly what my annotation consists of. I would love to be the type of person that writes super interesting marginalia and that you see their books and they have all sorts of things written on there that are not little hearts or little smiley faces. So that's the last thing that my idealized reader self would do. But yeah, so that's my idealized reader self car, sort of. I would love, if you want to film it, you can go ahead and film it, but if not, I would love to hear you in the comments what are some things that your idealized reader self does. Like, what are some things that you would be, oh, I would love to be the type of person that reads this and this, but I'm not. I would love to hear it in the comments. So yeah, that would be it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was a super creative concept and a creative idea. And yeah, so anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you happy reading, and I will see you next Sunday with another bookish video.